So military historian, U.S. Army veteran, educator, and award-winning author Mike Guardia is back on the show today. He's going to sit in on a couple of episodes here. He's back on the show to talk about his latest book, Foxbat Tales, the MiG-25 in Combat. I think I'm saying that right. He'll tell me. It is a follow-up to Wings of Fire, a combat history of the F-15, and Tomcat Fury, a combat history of the F-14. So we went from 14 to 15 to 25, but it's a MiG versus an F. I think that's what it is. But Mike is the author of a number of books. Go to his website, MikeGuardia.com. You can get them all on Amazon. He's written children's books and also a number of books following Hal Moore, also Russell W. Volkman. We've got Donald D. Blackburn. Just go check it all out. Don Starry, General Don Starry. So, again, MikeGuardia.com. We're also proud to have him as one of our experts here on Big Blend Radio. So, Mike, Military Mike, welcome back. How are you?
It's great to be back on the show. I am doing great.
Always good to have you on the show. And Foxbat Tales, the MiG-25 in Combat. Let me just go girly right away. It's all about the name. Okay. So, Foxbat, we went from Tomcat to Foxbat. Where does the Foxbat come from?
So this was actually a bit of a change of pace for me. I had never really considered doing any type of title on Soviet aviation till I came across the MiG-25. I had always been fascinated by Cold War airplanes, and I had always been fascinated by military aviation in the broadest sense. And that's really what prompted me to write the books on the F-14 and the F-15. But, as I started to expand my knowledge on what crates the latter-day Soviet Air Force had put out, I found that there was surprisingly little information on the MiG-25. And I was surprised at first because, for as much as the MiG-25 has done throughout its history and for as much of an alarm as it sounded within the Western intelligence community, I was surprised that there hadn't been more that had been written about it.
Is it possible that this is because the military would prefer that things not be written about? That, like specific airplanes and guns and such that they use in warfare, they try to keep that kind of under wraps?
Well, I don't think it's so much that they want to keep it under wraps. I just think that I think that getting access to the information, even if it's not classified, it just takes a lot of red tape and a lot of jumping through hoops. Really just to get your hands on something that's credible. And then again, many of the sources that are out there, even government sources, sometimes you have to take them with a grain of salt because one government will say one thing and one agency will say something completely different.
That sounds about right.
Yeah, that does. But the MiG, so it's a MiG, and it's interesting. So, and I do want to get into this because you think this is going to be some like crazy cool airplane or aircraft, I should say. And it turns out to be like super fast, but maybe not as like grand as everybody thought. But what does MiG stand for?
So MiG is an abbreviation for Mikoyan Ugurevich, which was the design bureau that created the MiG series aircraft. So essentially what they did is they took the first two letters of Mikoyan and then first letter of the second fellow's last name, Gurevich.
And I was just going to say, if you were going to put it into car terms, like would it be a Ferrari or a Ford? Uh-oh.
Well, let's see. I think in terms of speed, it would definitely be a Ferrari. In terms of reliability, it would probably be more akin to a Yugo.
Oh.
Now, would you put it in the Daytona, like a Daytona race or like a NASCAR race?
If the only thing it could do would go fast, yeah. But, if I wanted something that could be able to turn quickly or stop quickly on a dime, there's no way that I would put it up against anything else.
Yeah, because isn't it pretty bulky? This plane turns out to be, it's heavy and it kind of guzzled gas. It was a hungry beast.
It sure was. It could fly at speeds that were, to that point, deemed unreachable for any tactical fighter. Going fast was about the only thing that it could do. The pilot had to be careful, though, because even if he accelerated the engine to its absolute maximum speed, the plane could only sustain that speed for maybe a few minutes before it would burn out the engine.
Oh wow. And if you're in
That's
the enemy zone, that could not be good for you. You know,
No.
that's so it wasn't really a dog fighter, but you talk about it being an interceptor. And so, can we
Yes.
talk about what an interceptor does? I mean, it's almost, is it kind of like, hey, you can see dogfights are going on, but I'm going to like, here, look at me over here, so
get
that
in the middle.
the other dude can take you out.
Kind of. The big difference between a fighter and an interceptor is that an interceptor, really, it's designed to do only one thing. It's designed to go fast, interdict any planes that are encroaching over a country's territorial airspace, and be able to engage it from beyond visual range. Try to identify whether it's friendly or not, be able to escort said aircraft away from friendly airspace. And if it is identified as a hostile aircraft, then that interceptor can engage whatever hostile aircraft is out there.
Wow. And so
This sounds like Star Trek.
I know it does. I want a saber.
Pretty cool. Yeah,
it
is pretty cool.
I know. In writing this, I mean, you're saying there's not that much out there about it. So, I mean, it's got to have been hard to get the information. But were you also surprised? Because it seemed like the Americans were excited to get their hands on this, this aircraft. And then a little disappointed later.
Yeah, there was quite a lot that surprised me about it, because when I started researching the MiG-25, what I knew about it was pretty much just in the broadest general terms. I knew that it came about during the mid-'60s. I knew that it was breaking airspeed records for both east and west, and that simply the appearance of the MiG-25 alarmed a lot of people within the Western intelligence community. And I knew that after they finally got their hands on a copy of a MiG-25, that it turned out to be an aeronautical paper tiger. It was a big revelation that, hey, this plane that we thought was a versatile fighter bomber is really nothing more than a poorly designed airframe with an oversized motor. There's only one thing that this plane can do, and it can go fast. If this were to go into a classic dogfight with any fighter in the West, there's no question that it would be the loser.
Wow.
And that's when they realized, okay, we were wrong about this aircraft from the beginning, and we were actually on a wild goose chase. We were chasing ghosts, thinking that this was going to be the next supreme Soviet fighter. And it's really qualitatively not much better than any interceptor that we have here in the West. But they did praise it for a few things that some Western planes couldn't do. One of the things that they praised was the Smerch radar, which had a double band wavelength. What that means is that it made the MiG-25's radar invulnerable to jamming, and that was something that was something that no Western airborne radar could do at the time.
That's pretty cool, actually.
Yeah. I mean, and at the same time, I wonder if the Russians were kind of dangling it in front of America, going, "Check it out, haha, we have this," and kind of, you know what I mean? I mean, there was, it was what you say, July 1967. It was at the Moscow Air Show that they unveiled it, right? And did they do that to kind of show the Americans, hey, look what we have, you can't have it, and maybe they had something hidden that you didn't know what was going on. You know what I mean? I'm just wondering
So that ongoing game of geopolitical brinksmanship, I mean, that was ongoing for both sides. And what the U.S. found out later was that the prototype MiG-25s that had broken those airspeed records a decade earlier, those prototypes had been built from special materials simply for the sake of trying to break those airspeed records. That if you had taken those prototypes and put them on the front lines, they never would have functioned in combat.
Oh.
Yeah.
Wow.
So this is it gets in. Okay, so then, I mean, this plane goes on, plane or aircraft, I should say. So it goes on, and it's interesting because it did go into fights in the Soviet Afghan war. I mean, it went out all over. So it did have a life, but was interesting to me was how America got a hold of it. And the story with Lieutenant Viktor Belenko, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, what happened with him, because he said, that's it, I'm defecting and going to Japan. And that was, because what was interesting to me was he really, you think about someone who looked like he was dedicated to the Communist Party and Communist regime, I should say, but he's like, I'm bailing. I'm out of here. But he didn't take anything with him other than three things: the pilot's manual, his notebook, and his military ID. That's it. I mean, that's a true bail. I'm like, I'm out of here.
Right.
But he took the plane. And
Yeah, that's the big
so
thing.
how does that happen where we don't shoot it down when it's gone beyond what it's supposed to go beyond?
Well, this
Do
is
we not?
yeah, Russia. He went from Russia to Japan.
Mm-hmm.
But
how?
So
How did he get away
it
with it?
really is, yeah. So it really
Like,
is a story where truth is
That's
stranger than fiction. Belenko, by the time he was 29, he had had enough of the Communist Party. You know, his home life was falling apart. He had grown very disenchanted with the communist regime. You know, he said, "Why am I even still here? How much longer am I going to dedicate myself to living this lie?" So what he ended up doing was he said, okay, well, as a MiG-25 pilot assigned to this particular unit of the Soviet Air Defense Forces, I fly these routine aerial patrols over the Sea of Japan. Sometimes I'm the flight leader and sometimes I'm not. So for this particular sortie that's going up today, what I'm going to do, since I'm not the flight leader, I'm going to fall behind the lead formation. And I'm going to gradually space myself out from the main body of the flight group. And then after that happens, after I think I'm far enough out of visual range, I'm going to drop down below the radar range. Because standard surface-to-air radar can only see probably about 500 feet to 1,000 feet as its minimum engagement envelope. So if you fly below that, our radar is never going to see you coming. So what he did was descended down to a mere 100 feet above sea level. 100 feet.
wow. That's
And seeing nothing more than his own dead reckoning, his own muscle memory from some of the maps that he had looked at. He said, okay, if I think I stay on a course this for about 2 hours, 4 hours, or however long it is, I'm eventually going to see the Japanese mainland. So skimming above the sea at only 100 feet above sea level, he guns the engine to almost as fast as it will go, buzzing across the top of various fishing boats. And then after a few hours, he determines, okay, I'm probably in range of the Japanese coastline. So at some point, he elevates his plane from 100 feet of altitude to 20,000 feet. And when he hits the 20,000 foot mark, that's when he populates on the Japanese radar station. At first, the Japanese Air Force, they don't know what to make of it. They see this incoming fast mover that has apparently come out of nowhere, and they say, okay, we don't know what this is, but we don't think it can be good. And they scramble two Japanese They scramble these two Japanese F-4s from the Chitose Air Base. It's a comedy of errors at that point because those two Japanese planes couldn't find him.
Wow.
One, because Belenko was traveling too fast, and two, because the Japanese F-4s, you know, their radar systems weren't really optimized for an interceptor role anyway. And after a few hours, they're radioing back to their home station. Hey, boss, we can't find him. Now, during this flight, he gets a little bit disoriented, and he was trying to go to the nearest Japanese air base he could find. But because he had vectored off course a little bit, because remember, he didn't have any of his instrumentations that could work at a low-level flight, so he starts looking around and says, okay, well, I'm lost over Japanese airspace. I know I'm over the island of Hokkaido. I'm probably miles off course from the nearest Japanese military air station, but I think I'm close enough to the Hokkaido airport. And eventually he finds that civilian airport and says, okay, well, I'm running pretty low on fuel, so I guess I'm going to land. And the air traffic controllers on the ground there see his airplane. They don't know what it is, but they're like, okay, we weren't scheduled to receive any small aircraft today. I wonder what that is. And without even contacting the air traffic controllers, he vectors in behind a departing 727 and lands his MiG-25 on the tarmac. And and the thing is that the length of the runway is too short to accommodate the takeoff and landing speed of the MiG-25. So he skids off the runway. He plows through the dirt, and about 700 or so feet beyond the edge of the runway, that's when his plane skids to a halt. And by the time he shut off his engine, he had only 30 seconds of fuel left. And when his MiG-25 skidded to a halt, everybody on the ground in Hokkaido, you know, they of course were all freaking out. You know, the air traffic controllers were saying, oh my God, what's the Soviet plane doing here? Is this a precursor to an invasion? And they not only notify the Japanese military, they also notify the local precinct of the Japanese National Police.
Ooh.
And before the cops get there, every Japanese civilian within about a 1.5 mile radius, they start descending on this airplane because they want to see, hey, what's the Soviet plane doing here?
Mm.
And poor Belenko, he's regaining his bearings, gets out of the cockpit, sees this swarm of Japanese civilians coming towards him, and I think in a state of panic, he just draws his sidearm and he fires 2 warning shots into the air.
Whoa.
And the civilians scatter, but the local police don't. They actually take him into custody, and they say, you are under arrest on 2 charges. 1 for violating our territorial airspace, and 2 for illegally discharging a firearm.
Yeah.
But only a few minutes after he's arrested, he says, my name is Victor Belenko, defecting from the Soviet Union, and I would like political asylum in the U.S.
Cool.
And the very next place they take him is the CIA office.
There you go.
There it is.
Oh my gosh, here it goes. And that's
this
that's
is a great
interesting
movie.
I know. I think come on, Mike, Hal Moore has a movie, so you got to have one for Belenko. I'm just saying. This is just I mean, you've got to think, we talk about this on history shows all the time, how the bravery of going like on the Mayflower, or you're going to a new land because you're not happy where you are, but that power to do that bravery, I think it is bravery to be able to defect and do what he did. I mean, it's like it's all or nothing, and I really appreciate that when people are able to push themselves beyond instead of being unhappy all the time. You know what I mean? It's like, wow, okay, I'm going for my freedom. But it is interesting, this whole I want political asylum. Was America more about, I mean, I don't know if they could do that now. Do you think? I mean, it's kind of now we have issues with that happening now. Everyone's in an unrestful position about it in our country and around the world. And it's just interesting back then that he could even go, hey, I want political asylum in Japan. So here he has the manual, and he has his notebook, his flight notebook, and his military ID. So then people know, okay, this is who I am. And you have his photo in your book too. I'm like, I thought it was a young Vladimir Putin when I saw it. Like, really? It was like an immediate, like, I was like, oh, he looks, and it wasn't. No, I'm serious. He does. It's just his eyes and everything. But he's not him.
Wow.
Everybody. But the what he had on him. What happens with that? Because that's part of his value, not only being a pilot and being able to even fly into Japan how he did it. That's some value right there. But here he is with the goods and the plane. So, I mean, wouldn't Japan want to, I know they took him to the CIA office, but in a way, wouldn't Japan go, hey, we want that info?
Right. So the Japanese Defense Ministry, they were actually none too happy about having that MiG-25 in their country. And they said, okay, well, you have the Soviet Union that's only a few hundred miles off our coast. We really don't want to keep this plane here for too long, but we recognize the intelligence value. So soon after Belenko said that he wanted to defect to the U.S. and that he was looking for political asylum, they called every American aerospace contractor who was in the country at the time, along with a number of CIA operatives. And they all descended upon the plane, took it to a government facility there in Japan, and said, okay, well, we have it. We know the Soviets are going to want it back, and they're going to want it back pretty quick. So we have X amount of hours to deconstruct this plane, do every single analysis we can on it, find out what it is that makes the MiG-25 tick, and then we're going to give it back to the Soviets.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah.
Wow. Funny. Tinker Toys.
Right. So what they ended up doing was they ran a series of tests on the aircraft, and they tested everything. They tested everything from the onboard avionics to the engine itself. They were doing static tests to see how fast the engine could go and, how long it could operate before burning itself out. And I really have to give credit to the Japanese government. They were very crafty in how they gave it back to the Soviets. They said because the plane was damaged when it landed, and it was, they said, we're going to have to give it back to you in crates. So they crated the plane, and then they shipped it back to the USSR. Well, the Soviets, they weren't dummies. As soon as they got the crates, they opened them up, and they said, okay, well, it's not hard for us to put 2 and 2 together. They've probably tampered with this plane. We just need to find out what it is they know and how it's going to affect our own defense posture. So one of the first things that they found out was that the Americans had tampered with the Smerch radar. And how they found that out was they found foreign fuses and foreign transistors in the radar. And they said to themselves, okay, the Americans obviously didn't know how to operate this, and they broke it when they were testing it. And they tried to make some hasty repairs and hoped that we wouldn't notice.
Wow. I got them from my house.
Yeah.
It's like somebody goes downstairs in the basement and takes the fuses out of the fuse box and delivers them to NASA.
I know, but now was it really that they didn't, did they take them for a reason, or was it that they messed it up, just like what the Russians thought?
Well, they were trying to test the capabilities of the radar, and because they didn't know how to operate the radar, they ended up blowing some fuses and transistors in it.
Oh, so they really did, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so then it became a question of, oh gosh, what are we going to do now? We can't hide the fact that we've broken it. So let's try and find a replacement and hope that they don't notice.
Yeah.
Right. So that's why a lot of our machines these days have some kind of self-destruct mechanism. And
you mean that's how I feel about Facebook? Like I'm disabled.
That's very James Bond. That's very James Bond. It's cool.
I love this. This is cool. So then the MiG, I like this. The MiG-25. I feel like it's almost like a rock band name,
Yeah.
And Foxbat. I feel like
That'd
this
be
could
a great
be like
rock band.
it'd be a great album, Foxbat Tales. I like that. With this now, it continues on. America gets a little intel, but disappointing, and it continues on and ends up in fighting in the Middle East. It goes off and continues on in its life and journeys.
Mm-hmm. It sure does.
Wow.
It's in the twilight of its life now, but for the role that it was really intended to fulfill, which is that of an interceptor and a reconnaissance aircraft, it did excel in those roles, and it had a very long service life, one of the longest, really, of any third-generation military aircraft that was out there.
Cool.
Even though the Russians have retired it, and even though a lot of the former Soviet republics have retired it, it's still hanging on to a bit of its life in service in the Middle East.
It's interesting how everything turns around, and how armor and artillery and ammunitions and fighter jets and everything they have these international careers, and some get sold. We were talking about that before with you. About like, okay, this fighter jet now belongs to, Iran. Here now goes from here to here, and so it's interesting to me how that happens between countries and. We're all friends, and then we're not friends, and oopsie, I shouldn't have sold you that. So it's an interesting thing. You've taught us so much. All these fighter jets and everything that you've showcased on the show and in your books, just amazing. The stories of generals, but I feel like just the same thing as horses in battle. They have a story too. We're doing a segment on our Wednesday show, Mike, about dogs in World War II and how they played a role in World War II and in battles and everything. So I feel like, what you're doing with the aircraft is like telling the general's story in a way. You talk about, the different generals like Hal Moore. But at the same time, I think we do have to look at what happened to the individual aircraft. They have a story too. I know they're not living, but they are part of, life and the story of life. So I thank you for that. I think that's really cool. What's next though? Because you're nonstop, man. The Energizer Bunny of military history. What's the next book?
Okay. So actually have two on the horizon that I'm working on. One is complete, and it is going to be released this December 14th, I believe. And the book coming out this December is closely related to the topic of the MiG-25, except if we wind the clocks back about 20 years earlier, this book is focusing on the air war over the Eastern Front in World War II, where the Red Air Force was taking on the Luftwaffe. So that book is coming out in December, and then the other two projects that are currently in the works. One is that biography on Paul Gorman, and then the other is the companion piece to Fires of Babylon, telling the story of the Battle of 73 Easting, but from the perspective of Ghost Troop instead of Eagle Troop.
Wow. Man, you're rocking it. Well, everyone, again, keep up with Mike at MikeGuardia.com. He's also got pages on BlendRadioandTV.com. You can hear his different interviews with us over the years, literally, and also on NationalParkTraveling.com because he sent us out to follow in the footsteps of General.